The cold click of a grandfather clock echoed through the silent mansion, yet its hands never moved. In the great hall, an empty wheelchair sat motionless beside the hearth, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. And there, in the dim light filtering through heavy curtains, sat Lucas Harper, a man whose fortune could buy entire city blocks in downtown Chicago, yet couldn't purchase a single moment of peace. His weathered fingers trembled over a photograph faded by time, showing a woman's smile that once lit up his world, now nothing but shadows and regret. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph yourself, or remembering someone you lost long ago. Perhaps you're sitting in a quiet room, feeling the weight of years that have passed too quickly. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch the deepest corners of your soul. This is the story of Lucas Harper, a man who possessed everything the world deemed valuable, yet lived with a poverty of spirit that no amount of money could cure. And it's the story of 10-year-old Mia Rodriguez, a girl from the small farming community of Willowbrook, whose simple faith would shatter the walls around his heart. The autumn wind rattled the windows of his Lincoln Park mansion, where every surface gleamed with the polish of wealth but lacked the warmth of home. The scent of expensive leather mingled with the sterile smell of medical equipment, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a luxurious prison than a place of refuge. Lucas had built an empire worth hundreds of millions through strategic investments in real estate, technology stocks, and even cryptocurrency. His Bitcoin portfolio alone could fund a small country's budget. Yet, as he sat there, surrounded by the fruits of his success, he felt as empty as the unused rooms that stretched endlessly through his home. 6 months had passed since the accident that changed everything. 6 months since his legs had been crushed beneath the twisted metal of his Bentley on Lakeshore Drive. 6 months since he'd felt truly alive. The physical pain had subsided, replaced by a deeper ache that no amount of morphine could touch. His assets continued to grow, his dividends rolled in like clockwork, and his investment portfolio flourished under the careful management of his financial advisors. But what good was wealth when you couldn't feel your own legs? What value did money hold when the woman you'd planned to marry had walked away? Unable to handle the reality of loving a broken man, Lucas Harper had built his fortune on the foundation of control. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted. His penthouse office overlooking the Chicago River was a testament to precision, mahogany desks arranged with military exactness, computer monitors displaying real-time stock prices from around the world, and filing cabinets containing contracts worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But control, he had discovered, was an illusion. Life had a way of shattering even the most carefully constructed plans, leaving behind only fragments of what once was. The doctor spoke of his condition in clinical terms: complete paralysis below the waist, minimal chance of recovery, permanent disability. But Lucas knew the truth was simpler and more devastating. He was broken, and no amount of money could fix what was truly wrong with him. The morning light crept through the gaps in his bedroom curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that he could no longer feel beneath his feet. His daily routine had become a mechanical process: physical therapy sessions with expensive specialists, business calls conducted from his wheelchair, and endless hours staring at walls lined with awards and accolades that now seemed meaningless. His penthouse felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of dreams he'd never pursue, and the echo of laughter that would never return. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on him with each passing hour. Then came the letter. Not delivered through his usual channels of communication, no secretary screening it, no security checking its contents, just a simple envelope slipped under his office door on a Tuesday morning when the October wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the streets of Chicago. The paper was cheap, the kind used in small-town schools, and the handwriting belonged to a child. But something about it made Lucas set aside the financial reports he'd been reviewing. something that whispered of a world beyond profit margins and investment returns. Dear Mr. Harper, the letter began in careful rounded letters. My name is Mia Rodriguez. I live in Willowbrook, about an hour from your city. My grandmother remembers you from when you were young and used to visit our town with your family during summers. She says you were different then, that you smiled and laughed and believed in magic. I don't know if you remember those times, but I wanted to tell you that I believe in magic too. My grandmother is very sick now, and I've been praying for her every day. She told me about your accident, and I've been praying for you too. I know I'm just a little girl, and you're a very important man, but I wanted you to know that someone is thinking about you. Maybe someday you could visit our town again. I think you might remember how to smile here. With love and prayers, Mia. Lucas read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly as he held the fragile paper. He couldn't remember the last time someone had written to him without wanting something. Money, investments, business deals. This child asked for nothing, offered nothing but the simple gift of acknowledgement and prayer. For a moment, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd thought was buried forever beneath layers of cynicism and pain. But just as quickly, his practical mind reasserted itself. What could a child possibly understand about loss, about the weight of responsibility, about the crushing reality of a life forever altered? He placed the letter in his desk drawer, determined to forget about it. But late that night, as he lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city, Mia's words echoed in his mind. Someone was thinking about him, someone was praying for him, in a world that seemed to have forgotten his humanity, reducing him to nothing more than his net worth and business acumen. A child in a small farming town remembered that he was more than the sum of his assets. Despite himself, Lucas found his thoughts drifting toward Willowbrook, toward memories of summer days when the world seemed full of infinite possibility, and his legs carried him toward adventures he'd thought would last forever. The next morning brought another letter, and then another. Each one was brief, written in that same careful handwriting, sharing simple stories of life in Willowbrook. Mia wrote about helping her mother tend their small garden, about the way the morning mist looked rolling across the cornfields, about old Mrs. Henderson's cat who'd had kittens in the barn. Her words painted pictures of a world Lucas had almost forgotten, a place where time moved differently, where people measured success not in dollars and cents, but in acts of kindness and moments of joy. Despite his determination to remain unmoved, Lucas found himself looking forward to her letters. They arrived with no particular schedule, sometimes daily, sometimes with gaps of several days, but each one brought a breath of fresh air into his sterile world. Mia wrote about her grandmother's stories, about school plays and church picnics, about the way the autumn leaves looked like scattered coins across the ground. Her innocent observations stood in stark contrast to the complex financial documents that usually occupied his attention, yet somehow her simple words carried more weight than million-dollar contracts. 3 weeks after the first letter arrived, Lucas made a decision that surprised even himself. He instructed his driver to prepare the specially modified van that allowed him to travel despite his wheelchair, and he set out for Willowbrook. The journey took him through familiar countryside, past fields he'd once run through as a child, past the small towns where his family had stopped for ice cream during those long-ago summer visits. As the Chicago skyline faded behind him and the landscape opened into rolling farmland, something in his chest began to loosen, as if he'd been holding his breath for months and was finally allowing himself to exhale. Willowbrook hadn't changed much in the decades since his last visit. Main Street still consisted of a handful of shops, a diner with vinyl booths and checkered floors, and a church whose white steeple reached toward the endless sky. The Rodriguez family lived in a small house at the edge of town, surrounded by gardens that showed the careful attention of someone who understood the language of growing things. When Lucas knocked on the door, he half expected to find that Mia was a figment of his imagination, some elaborate hoax designed to separate him from his fortune. Instead, he found himself looking into the brightest brown eyes he'd ever seen, set in the face of a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore clothes that had clearly been mended more than once, yet she carried herself with a dignity that would have impressed the boardrooms of Chicago. When she smiled, it was like watching the sun emerge from behind clouds, transforming not just her face, but the entire world around her. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of her heritage, "I knew you would come. I've been praying so hard for you to remember who you used to be." Her mother appeared behind her, Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose hands spoke of honest work and whose eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned to be careful with trust. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back severely and lines around her eyes that suggested she'd carried more than her share of worry. When she saw Lucas in his expensive wheelchair, wearing clothes that cost more than most families in Willowbrook earned in a month, her expression became guarded. "Mia has been writing to you without my permission," Elena said, her English careful and precise. "I hope she hasn't been bothering you with her letters. She's just a child who doesn't understand the difference between our worlds." But Lucas found himself unable to look away from Mia, who stood behind her mother with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the universe. When she looked at him, he didn't see pity or discomfort at his condition. She simply saw him, perhaps more clearly than anyone had in months. "Your letters," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "they weren't a bothering. They were—" He paused, searching for words that had become foreign to him. They were a gift? That afternoon, Mia took him on a tour of Willowbrook, pushing his wheelchair along dirt roads that his expensive vehicle would never have managed. She showed him the creek where she and her friends caught tadpoles, the old oak tree where her grandmother had carved her initials as a young woman, the field where corn stretched toward the horizon like a green sea. As they moved through her world, Lucas began to notice things he'd forgotten how to see, the way the light fell through the leaves, the sound of wind moving through growing things, the scent of earth that held the promise of next year's harvest. "My grandmother says you used to climb that tree," Mia said, pointing toward a massive oak that stood at the center of the town square. "She says you weren't afraid of anything when you were young." Lucas stared at the tree, and for a moment he could almost remember the boy he'd been, fearless, curious, believing that the world was full of adventures waiting to be discovered. That boy felt like a stranger now, someone who'd lived in a different lifetime before responsibility and ambition had taught him to measure every action against its potential profit. "I was different then," he said quietly. "Maybe you still are," Mia replied, her voice carrying a certainty that made him want to believe her. "Maybe you just forgot for a while." That evening, Elena reluctantly invited Lucas to stay for dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans and vegetables from their garden, served at a table that wobbled slightly and required a folded napkin under one leg to stay level. The food was nothing like the elaborate cuisine prepared by his personal chef, yet it tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. Perhaps it was the company, or perhaps it was simply the act of sharing a meal with people who expected nothing from him except conversation. As they ate, Mia told stories about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a teacher someday so she could help other children learn to read. She spoke with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never doubted that her dreams were achievable, that the world would make space for whatever she chose to become. Lucas found himself drawn into her vision of the future, a place where kindness mattered more than bank accounts and where success was measured in smiles rather than stock options. "What do you dream about, Mr. Harper?" Mia asked suddenly. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. The question caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had asked him about his dreams? His days were filled with goals and objectives, profit margins and growth projections, but dreams. Those belonged to the boy who'd climbed oak trees and believed in magic, not to the man who'd learned to calculate the monetary value of everything he touched. "I used to dream about building things," he said finally, "not just buildings or businesses, but things that mattered, things that would make the world better." "You still could," Mia said simply. "Dreams don't have expiration dates like milk in the refrigerator. They just wait for you to remember them." As Lucas drove back to Chicago that night, Mia's words followed him through the darkness. The city lights seemed harsher than usual, the sounds more jarring after the gentle quiet of Willowbrook. His penthouse felt even more empty than before, filled with expensive furniture that no one sat on and rooms that echoed with his solitude. But something had shifted during his visit, some fundamental understanding about what he'd lost and what might still be possible to recover. The letters continued, but now they carried a different weight. Mia wrote about her grandmother's worsening condition, about helping her mother with the household expenses, about the prayer circle at church that met every Wednesday to pray for people who were hurting. She never asked for money, never hinted that her family's financial struggles might be eased by his wealth. Instead, she offered something far more valuable, the gift of being seen not as a source of funds, but as a human being worthy of care and concern. "I've been thinking about what you said about building things that matter," she wrote in one letter. "My grandmother says that the most important things we build can't be seen with our eyes, things like trust and love and hope. She says that broken people can build the strongest things because they know what it feels like to need something solid to lean on." Lucas read that letter sitting in his office, surrounded by monitors displaying his various investment portfolios. His assets had grown by another $2 million that week. His cryptocurrency holdings had reached new heights, and his real estate investments were generating returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections. Yet, none of those numbers brought him the satisfaction he felt from a child's simple observation about the nature of building and healing. Over the following weeks, Lucas found himself making the drive to Willowbrook more frequently. Each visit revealed new layers to Mia's character, her fierce loyalty to her friends, her patient care for her aging grandmother, her ability to find joy in the smallest moments. She had a way of asking questions that made him examine assumptions he'd held for decades, challenging him to consider perspectives that had never occurred to his business-focused mind. "Do you think money makes people happy?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by the creek, watching minnows dart through the shallow water. "It can solve a lot of problems," Lucas replied, giving the answer he'd used countless times in interviews and board meetings. "But does it make them happy?" Mia persisted. "Like, in their hearts?" Lucas found himself really considering the question for the first time. His wealth had given him security, power, and the ability to control his environment in ways most people could never imagine. But happiness, joy, those felt like luxuries he'd been unable to afford, despite having enough money to buy almost anything else. "I thought it would," he admitted, "but I think I might have been wrong." Mia nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "My grandmother says that happiness is like water. You can't hold on to it by squeezing tighter. You have to cup your hands gently and be grateful for what stays." Her grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez, was a woman who'd lived through more hardship than Lucas could imagine. She'd raised 6 children while working in the fields, had buried a husband too young, and now faced her final illness with a grace that humbled him. When he met her, she was confined to a hospital bed that had been moved into the living room, her once strong body reduced to fragile bones and translucent skin. But her eyes still held the spark that had guided her family through decades of struggle. "Mijo," she said to Lucas, using the Spanish term of endearment that made him feel like part of the family. "That little girl writes to you because she sees something in you that maybe you've forgotten. Don't waste the gift she's given you." "What gift is that?" Lucas asked. Rosa smiled, her weathered hand reaching out to pat his arm with surprising strength. "The chance to remember that you're more than what you own, that your heart is bigger than your bank account, that the boy who used to climb trees is still in there, waiting for someone to believe in him again." As autumn deepened into winter, their friendship grew stronger. Mia would wait for him after school, eager to share the day's adventures and listen to his stories about the business world that seemed as foreign to her as her agricultural community had initially seemed to him. She had an uncanny ability to ask exactly the right questions, to push him toward insights he might never have reached on his own. "Why did you stop visiting Willowbrook when you were young?" she asked one day as they watched the first snow of the season dust the bare fields. Lucas had never really examined that decision, had simply accepted it as part of growing up, part of leaving childish things behind in pursuit of more serious goals. "I suppose I thought I'd outgrown it," he said. "I had bigger dreams, more important things to focus on." "But were they actually more important?" Mia asked. "The things you were focusing on?" The question haunted him for days. What had been so crucial that it required him to abandon the places and people that had brought him joy? His pursuit of wealth and status had consumed decades of his life, had driven him to work 18-hour days and sacrifice relationships on the altar of ambition. And what did he have to show for it? A portfolio worth hundreds of millions and a heart that felt emptier than his abandoned childhood bedroom. By December, Rosa's condition had deteriorated significantly. The family gathered around her bed during what the doctor said would likely be her final weeks, and Lucas found himself included in that circle as naturally as if he'd been born into it. He'd never experienced the kind of closeness that existed between the Rodriguez family members, the way they supported each other through crisis with a combination of practical help and emotional presence that his own wealthy family had never managed to master. "She's not afraid," Mia told him one evening as they sat in the kitchen while Elena and her sisters took turns at Rosa's bedside. "Grandmother says dying is just changing addresses, moving from one house to another. She says the people we love get there first to make sure everything's ready for us." Lucas marveled at the child's matter-of-fact acceptance of mortality, her ability to find comfort in concepts that his rational mind struggled to process. He'd spent months after his accident raging against the unfairness of life, the random cruelty that could destroy a person's future in a split second. But Mia seemed to understand something about acceptance that he was only beginning to glimpse. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "About people we love waiting for us?" Mia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think love is stronger than a lot of things we can't understand. Grandmother says that when people really love each other, part of them stays connected even when they can't see each other anymore, like invisible strings that never break." That night, Lucas dreamed of invisible strings for the first time in months. Not the kind of dreams that came with his sleeping medication, but real dreams full of color and hope and the faces of people who mattered more than profit margins. He woke feeling more rested than he had since the accident, as if some fundamental tension in his body had finally released its hold. Rosa Rodriguez died on a Sunday morning in January, slipping away peacefully while her family sang the hymns she'd taught them as children. Lucas had never witnessed someone's final moments, had never seen how a room could simultaneously hold profound sadness and inexplicable peace. The funeral was held at the small church Mia attended, and Lucas was surprised to find himself included among the pallbearers, men who considered it an honor to carry Rosa on her final journey. After the service, as the family gathered at the Rodriguez home to share food and memories, Lucas found himself in conversation with Father Miguel, the priest who'd known Rosa for 40 years. The older man had a gentle wisdom that reminded Lucas of qualities he'd once hoped to develop in himself, before ambition had redirected his priorities. "Rosa talked about you often these past few months," Father Miguel said. "She said Mia's letters had awakened something in you that had been sleeping for a long time." "That little girl sees something in me that I'm not sure exists anymore," Lucas replied. "Children have a gift for seeing people as they truly are," the priest observed. "Adults learn to see surfaces, wealth, status, success, but children look deeper, to the parts of us that don't change no matter what happens to our bodies or our circumstances." Lucas spent that evening helping Elena sort through Rosa's belongings, a task that revealed the accumulation of a life lived with intention rather than excess. Unlike his own home, filled with expensive items he rarely used, Rosa's possessions told stories. Photographs of family gatherings, handmade quilts that had warmed generations of children, recipes written in fading ink on index cards, stained with decades of use. Take this, Elena said, handing him a small wooden cross that had hung above Rose's bed. She wanted you to have it. She said it wasn't about religion, but about remembering that some things are worth believing in, even when we can't prove them scientifically. Lucas held the simple wooden cross, feeling its weight in his palm. It had been carved by hand, probably worth no more than a few dollars by any financial measure, yet it felt more valuable than most items in his art collection. This was what Mia had been trying to teach him, that worth couldn't always be calculated, that the most important things in life existed beyond the realm of assets and investments. Winter deepened, and with Rose's death, something shifted in Lucas's relationship with the Rodriguez family. He found himself taking on responsibilities he'd never imagined, helping Elena with paperwork related to her mother's estate, driving Mia to school events when their old car wouldn't start, sitting with the family during the long, quiet evenings when grief felt too heavy to carry alone. These experiences introduced him to aspects of life he'd insulated himself from for decades. He learned about the stress of living paycheck to paycheck, about the difficult choices families made between paying for medicine and buying groceries, about the weight of responsibility that came with caring for others without the safety net of unlimited financial resources. For the first time, his wealth felt less like an achievement and more like an accident of circumstance. "My mom's been working extra shifts at the diner," Mia told him one afternoon as they walked through the town park, bare trees reaching toward a gray winter sky. "She's worried about being able to afford the house payments now that grandmother isn't here to help. But she won't let me quit my piano lessons even though we can't really afford them anymore. She says music is too important to give up." Lucas found himself thinking about Mia's piano lessons as he returned to Chicago that evening. His portfolio had gained another $1 million that day through a particularly successful cryptocurrency trade, money that had materialized through nothing more than market fluctuations and timing. Yet, a little girl might have to give up music lessons because her family couldn't spare the $60 a month they cost. The disparity felt obscene in a way that all his previous wealth had never bothered him. For weeks, he wrestled with the desire to help Elena and Mia financially. His rational mind told him it would be simple. He could easily cover their mortgage, pay for Mia's education, ensure they never had to worry about money again. But he'd learned enough about the Rodriguez family to know that such an offer might be perceived as charity, might alter the dynamic of his friendship with Mia in ways that could damage something precious. Instead, he found himself considering larger questions about the purpose of wealth, about the responsibility that came with having more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. His business empire continued to grow almost automatically, managed by teams of experts who multiplied his assets through careful investments and strategic acquisitions. But what was the point of accumulating wealth if it never translated into meaningful impact on the lives of people who mattered to him? The solution came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the frozen fields of Willowbrook. Rather than offering direct financial help to individual families, he could create something larger, a foundation that would support the entire community, that would provide opportunities for children like Mia, while honoring the values that made places like Willowbrook special. It would be a way of building something that mattered, something that would outlast his physical existence and create lasting change. He spent the spring months developing his vision, working with lawyers and financial advisors to structure an organization that would serve rural communities throughout the Midwest. The Harper Foundation would provide educational scholarships, support for family farms, funding for small-town infrastructure projects, and medical assistance for families dealing with serious illness. But more than that, it would be guided by principles he'd learned from a 10-year-old girl, that success should be measured in lives improved rather than profits generated, that the most valuable investments were those made in human potential. When he presented the idea to Elena and Mia, their reactions revealed everything he'd hoped to understand about the difference between charity and empowerment. Elena's initial suspicion that he was trying to buy their friendship or assuage his own guilt gave way to recognition that he was offering something larger, a way for the community to help itself rather than becoming dependent on his generosity. "This isn't about us," she said finally, after reviewing the foundation's mission statement and structure. "This is about a lot of families, about giving children opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise." Mia's response was characteristically direct. "You're remembering how to build things that matter," she said, echoing their conversation from months earlier. "Grandmother would be proud of you." The summer that followed was unlike any Lucas had experienced. Instead of monitoring stock prices and investment returns from his sterile penthouse, he found himself traveling throughout rural Illinois, visiting communities that would benefit from the foundation's work. He met farmers struggling to keep family land that had been in their families for generations, teachers working with outdated textbooks and inadequate supplies, parents dreaming of college educations for their children but lacking the resources to make those dreams reality. Each community had its own version of Mia: bright, hopeful children who saw possibilities where adults saw only obstacles, young people who carried the future in their hearts despite current limitations. Through these encounters, Lucas began to understand that his accident hadn't taken away his ability to walk. It had cleared away the distractions that had prevented him from seeing where he was supposed to go. As autumn returned, marking a full year since he'd first visited Willowbrook, Lucas realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in his perspective, but in his physical condition. The constant pain that had defined his existence since the accident had gradually diminished, not through medical intervention, but through what could only be described as a lightening of spiritual burden. When his physical therapist commented on his improved muscle tone and enhanced mobility, Lucas credited not the exercises, but the sense of purpose that had returned to his daily existence. The first time he stood up from his wheelchair without assistance, he was alone in his penthouse, reaching for a photograph of Mia and her grandmother that he'd placed on a high shelf. The action was instinctive, thoughtless, and only after he'd grasped the frame did he realize what he'd done. His legs, which had been numb and unresponsive for over a year, had somehow found the strength to support his weight. The sensation was like electrical current running through circuits that had been disconnected, awakening pathways that medical experts had declared permanently damaged. He called no one, announced nothing, made no dramatic proclamations. Instead, he spent that evening slowly walking through his home, reacquainting himself with the feeling of his own feet against the ground. Each step was tentative, uncertain, but undeniably real. By the time the sun set over Lake Michigan, he had walked from his bedroom to his kitchen and back again 3 times, covering more ground under his own power than he had since the morning of his accident. The miracle, if it could be called that, wasn't the physical healing, but the recognition of what had made it possible. His body had responded not to medical treatment, but to the restoration of purpose, the return of hope, the rebuilding of connections to people and causes that mattered more than personal gain. Mia had been right. Healing sometimes came from things that couldn't be seen or bought, from the intangible forces that connected hearts across differences in age, background, and circumstance. When he visited Willowbrook the next weekend, he waited until he was alone with Mia before revealing his progress. They were sitting by the creek where they'd had so many conversations, watching the water flow toward whatever destiny awaited it downstream. Without announcement or fanfare, he stood up from his wheelchair and took the few steps necessary to reach the water's edge, kneeling to touch the surface with his fingertips. Mia's reaction was everything he could have hoped for, and nothing like he expected. She didn't gasp or cry out in amazement. Instead, she smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone witnessing the completion of something that had always been inevitable. "I knew you would walk again," she said simply. "I've been praying for it every night, but I think the praying was just helping you remember what your body already knew how to do." "How could you know that?" Lucas asked, still marveling at the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. "Because walking isn't just about legs," Mia replied with the wisdom that had guided their friendship from the beginning. "It's about having somewhere important to go and believing you deserve to get there. You've been finding your way back to yourself all year. Your body was just waiting for your heart to show it the direction. That evening, as they sat around Elena's dinner table, Lucas no longer needing his wheelchair to join them, the conversation turned to the Foundation's first year of operations and the changes it had brought to communities throughout the region. Dozens of children had received college scholarships, family farms had been saved from foreclosure, and small-town schools had been equipped with modern technology that connected rural students to educational opportunities they'd never imagined possible. But the statistics, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the real transformation that had occurred. Lucas had rediscovered the joy of building something meaningful, of using his wealth as a tool for positive change rather than simply accumulating assets for their own sake. More importantly, he'd learned to receive as well as give, to accept the gifts of friendship and love that Mia and her family had offered without expectation of return. "What happens now?" Elena asked as they cleared the dishes from their simple meal. "Now that you're walking again, now that the foundation is established." Lucas considered the question while helping Mia dry the glasses, another small domestic task that would have been impossible from his wheelchair, but now felt natural and necessary. What did happen now? His old life was waiting for him in Chicago, with its corporate responsibilities and financial pressures, all the demands of maintaining and growing an enormous fortune. But that existence felt as foreign now as Willowbrook had seemed on his first visit. "I think," he said slowly, "I keep building things that matter. Keep learning from people like Mia and Rosa about what's actually important. Maybe I spend more time walking through places like this instead of sitting in boardrooms calculating profit margins." Mia looked up from the dish towel she was folding, her expression serious. "Promise me something, Mr. Harper." "Anything," he replied, and meant it more completely than any promise he'd ever made in a business context. "Promise me you won't forget what you learned here when you go back to your big city and your important meetings. Promise me you'll remember that the best things in life don't come with price tags, and that sometimes the smallest people have the biggest things to teach us." Lucas knelt down to meet Mia at eye level, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "I promise you, Mia Rodriguez, that I will never forget what you've taught me. And I promise that wherever I go, whatever I build, I'll carry your grandmother's cross and your mother's strength and your faith with me. You've given me back my life, not just my legs, but my life. That's not something a person forgets." 3 months later, Lucas made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He sold his Chicago penthouse and most of his luxury possessions, keeping only what held genuine sentimental value. Using the proceeds, he purchased a modest home in Willowbrook, not as a retreat or weekend property, but as his primary residence. The house was small by his previous standards, but large enough for the life he wanted to build, with a front porch where he could sit on summer evenings and watch Mia play with her friends in the yard. His business empire continued to function effectively, with him spending more time on foundation work and less on profit maximization. He discovered that wealth, like happiness, was indeed like water. The more tightly he'd tried to control it, the more it had slipped through his fingers. By loosening his grip, by using his resources as tools for positive impact rather than measures of personal worth, he found that financial success followed naturally from purposeful living. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some of his former business associates questioned his judgment, suggesting that his accident had affected his decision-making abilities in ways that went beyond the physical. His extended family, who'd never understood his connection to Willowbrook, worried that he was experiencing some sort of extended emotional breakdown that required professional intervention. But Lucas had learned to measure success by different standards now. When Mia brought home straight A's on her report card, when Elena was able to quit her second job because the foundation had funded a rural healthcare clinic that employed her as a full-time nurse's aide, when former classmates of his from Chicago visited Willowbrook and left talking about the peace they'd felt there, these victories meant more to him than any stock option or real estate deal ever had. The anniversary of Rosa's death brought the entire community together for a memorial service that celebrated not just her life, but the legacy she'd left in the lives she'd touched. As Lucas listened to story after story about Rosa's kindness, her wisdom, her ability to see potential in people when they couldn't see it in themselves, he understood that this was the kind of immortality worth pursuing, the continuation of love and hope through the lives of people who carried forward the best of what they had received. Standing in the cemetery afterward, looking at Rosa's headstone while Mia placed fresh wildflowers on the grave, Lucas reflected on the year that had changed everything. He could walk again, yes, but that was the least significant of his recoveries. He'd regained his capacity for wonder, his ability to find joy in simple pleasures, his understanding that the most valuable things in life, love, friendship, purpose, hope, couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. "Do you miss your old life?" Mia asked as they walked home through the gathering dusk. Her hand slipped naturally into his. Lucas considered the question honestly. Did he miss the adrenaline rush of high-stakes financial deals, the respect that came with commanding vast resources, the sense of power that accompanied extreme wealth? There were moments when his old ambitions stirred, when he wondered what he might be accomplishing if he'd remained focused on building his business empire, rather than redirecting his energy toward community development. "Sometimes I miss feeling important in the way the world defines importance," he admitted. "But I've learned the difference between being important and mattering. Anyone with enough money can be important for a while. But mattering, making a real difference in people's lives, that's something you can only do by connecting with others in authentic ways." As they reached Elena's front porch, where warm light spilled through windows and the scent of tonight's dinner lingered in the air, Lucas realized he'd found something he'd never known he was missing. This was what home felt like. Not a place where he stored his possessions, but a community where he was known and loved not for what he owned, but for who he chose to be. Years passed, and the Harper Foundation grew beyond Lucas's original vision. What had started as a way to give back to one small community expanded into a network of support that touched hundreds of rural towns throughout the Midwest. Educational programs, healthcare initiatives, agricultural support, and small business development grants created a web of opportunity that allowed young people to choose whether to stay in their home communities or pursue dreams that took them elsewhere, but always with the knowledge that they carried the values of their upbringing wherever they went. Mia grew from a 10-year-old girl into a 16-year-old young woman, her wisdom deepening with experience, but her essential kindness unchanged. She remained Lucas's closest confidant, the person whose opinion mattered most when he faced difficult decisions about the foundation's direction or his own life choices. Their friendship had evolved from mentor and student to something more like family, built on shared experiences and mutual respect that transcended their differences in age and background. On a warm evening in late spring, as Lucas sat on his front porch reading through scholarship applications for the Foundation's newest class of recipients, Mia joined him with a cup of the coffee Elena had taught him to prepare the way Rosa had preferred it, strong enough to wake the dead, sweet enough to remind you that life contained pleasures worth savoring. "I've been thinking about something Grandmother used to say," Mia said, settling into the chair beside him that he'd added to the porch specifically for these evening conversations. "She used to tell me that people come into our lives for 3 reasons. Some are here to teach us something, some are here to learn something from us, and some are here to walk with us for part of the journey." Lucas set down the scholarship applications, giving Mia his full attention. Even at 16, her observations carried the kind of insight that took most people decades to develop, if they developed it at all. "Which do you think I was for you?" she continued. "A teacher, a student, or companion?" Lucas smiled, remembering the 10-year-old girl who'd first asked him about his dreams, who'd challenged him to remember that happiness couldn't be purchased, who'd seen through his cynicism to the wounded heart beneath. "I think you were all 3, he said. "You taught me what actually mattered. You learned from me that adults don't always have the answers they pretend to have, and you've walked beside me through the most important transformation of my life." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across the yard where children from throughout the neighborhood often played. Lucas had learned to find deep satisfaction in such moments, the peace that came from living in harmony with natural rhythms rather than fighting them, the contentment that arose from knowing his life had meaning beyond personal achievement. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't written that first letter?" Mia asked eventually. Lucas had wondered about that many times, though he'd never shared those thoughts with anyone. What trajectory would his life have taken if he had remained isolated in his Chicago penthouse, measuring his days in stock prices and board meetings? Would he have eventually found his own path to healing, or would he have remained trapped in a prison of his own construction until his wealth became his epitaph? "I think you saved my life," he said simply, "not just by helping me walk again, but by reminding me why walking was worth doing. You showed me that being broken didn't mean being worthless, that healing was possible even when the doctor said it wasn't, and that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold." Mia leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we saved each other. You came into our lives when we needed someone to believe that dreams were possible, that working hard and being kind could actually lead to good things happening. You showed me that wealth and power didn't have to make people cold or selfish, that someone could have everything the world offered and still choose to care about people like us." As the evening deepened and the streetlights began to flicker on throughout Willowbrook, Lucas reflected on the extraordinary ordinariness of his current life. His daily routine involved reviewing foundation applications, visiting communities that had received grants, working in the garden Elena had helped him plant behind his house, and sharing meals with neighbors who included him in their lives not because of his wealth, but because of his willingness to be present for both their joys and their struggles. His net worth, while still substantial, no longer defined his identity or determined his daily decisions. The cryptocurrency investments that had once seemed so crucial now felt like distant concerns, important only insofar as they provided resources for the foundation's work. He'd learned that wealth was most satisfying when it flowed through his life toward purposes larger than his own comfort or security, when it became a river rather than a reservoir. The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by Dr. Peterson with the kind of gentle directness that physicians develop when they've had to share difficult news too many times. The aggressive form of lymphoma that had invaded Lucas's system would respond to treatment, the doctor explained, but the prognosis required realistic expectations about both the process and the outcome. Lucas received the news with a calmness that surprised even himself. 3 years earlier, such a diagnosis would have sent him into panic about unfinished business deals, incomplete investment strategies, the various ways his death might impact his financial empire. Now, his first thoughts were about the foundation's future leadership, about ensuring Mia would have fully funded college scholarships regardless of what happened to him, about the various community projects that needed his continued support. When he told Elena and Mia about his illness, their responses revealed the depth of the relationships he'd built over the years. Elena immediately began researching treatment centers and alternative therapies, with the fierce determination of someone who'd fought too hard for her family to lose another member without exhausting every possible option. Mia listened to the medical details with surprising maturity, asking practical questions about timelines and treatment options that showed she understood the seriousness of the situation. But it was what Mia said later, as they sat together in the gathering dusk, that revealed her continued capacity to offer wisdom that exceeded her years. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her hand finding his in the way it had during countless conversations over the past few years. "Not of dying," Lucas replied honestly. "I've lived more in the past 3 years than I did in the 40 years before that. I'm afraid of leaving projects unfinished, of not being able to see you graduate from college, of missing all the ways you're going to change the world." Mia smiled, her expression carrying an echo of the confidence she'd shown as a 10-year-old girl writing letters to a stranger in Chicago. "Maybe that's what love is. caring more about what happens to other people than what happens to yourself. And maybe that's how people like you and grandmother never really die, because the love you put into the world keeps growing even when your body can't keep up with it anymore. The months that followed brought both challenges and unexpected gifts. The chemotherapy treatments were difficult, requiring frequent trips to Chicago for medical appointments that reminded Lucas of his former life while reinforcing his appreciation for his current one. But the support he received from the Willowbrook community revealed networks of care and mutual assistance that no amount of money could have purchased. Neighbors took turns driving him to appointments when Elena couldn't get time off work. The women from Rose's church prayer circle organized meal deliveries that ensured he never had to worry about cooking during his weakest days. Children from throughout the town made get-well cards with crayons and markers, filling his mailbox with artwork that proved more effective at lifting his spirits than any expensive pharmaceutical intervention. Mia, now 17 and preparing for her senior year of high school, appointed herself as his primary companion during the treatment process. She would sit with him during the long chemotherapy sessions, reading aloud from books she'd chosen specifically for their ability to transport him beyond the sterile medical environment. Her selections ranged from classic literature to contemporary poetry, from biographies of people who'd overcome significant challenges to simple stories about the triumph of kindness over cruelty. "Why did you pick this one?" Lucas asked one afternoon, as Mia finished reading a story about a teacher who'd transformed an inner-city school through unconventional methods. "Because it's about someone who used what they had to make things better for other people," Mia replied. "Just like what you did with the foundation, just like what grandmother did with our family. I think those are the best kinds of stories, the ones that remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they focus on helping others instead of just helping themselves." The treatment proved more successful than Dr. Peterson had initially hoped. By spring, Lucas's cancer had gone into remission, his energy had returned, and his prognosis had improved significantly. But the experience had provided him with a different kind of education about mortality, about the importance of using whatever time remained for purposes that would outlast his physical existence. As Mia's high school graduation approached, Lucas found himself reflecting on the full arc of their friendship. The scared, angry man in a wheelchair, who'd first driven to Willowbrook, had been transformed by his relationship with a girl who'd seen past his wealth and status to the wounded person beneath. But the transformation hadn't been one-sided. Mia had grown from a child writing letters to a stranger into a young woman whose wisdom and compassion had been shaped partly by their years of conversation and mutual support. On graduation day, Lucas sat with Elena in the high school gymnasium, watching Mia deliver the valedictorian speech she'd written about the importance of community, the power of believing in people's potential, and the responsibility that came with receiving education and opportunity. Her words were eloquent and inspiring, but what moved Lucas most was the recognition that this young woman would soon be leaving Willowbrook to attend the university where she'd earned a full scholarship, partly through her own academic achievements and partly through the foundation's support. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, Lucas found a quiet moment with Mia near the roses that grew beside the school's entrance. The evening air was warm and filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of laughter, a perfect backdrop for a conversation that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "I have something for you," Lucas said, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve a small wooden box. Inside was Rose's cross, the one Elena had given him years earlier, now attached to a delicate gold chain suitable for a young woman beginning her adult life. "I can't take this," Mia protested. "It belongs to your family." "You are my family," Lucas replied simply. "Not by blood, but by choice, by shared experiences, by the kind of love that develops between people who've helped each other become better versions of themselves. Your grandmother wanted me to have this cross, and now I want you to have it, to carry forward the faith and wisdom she represented." As Mia fastened the chain around her neck, The small wooden cross settling against her heart, Lucas felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of their relationship, but the fulfillment of its primary purpose, the mutual growth and support that had allowed both of them to become more than they might have been alone. "Promise me something," he said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him years earlier. "Anything," Mia replied with a smile that showed she recognized the reference. "Promise me that you'll remember where you came from while you're discovering where you're going. Promise me that you'll use whatever you learn, whatever you achieve, to build things that matter, to help people the way you helped me. And promise me that you'll come home sometimes, because this place and these people will always be part of who you are, no matter how far your dreams take you." Years continued to pass, marked by the rhythm of seasons and the gradual changes that time brought to Willowbrook. Mia excelled in college, earning degrees in both education and social work, then returning to the Midwest to develop programs that brought urban educational resources to rural communities. Her work expanded the impact of the Harper Foundation, while carrying forward the values she'd learned from her grandmother and refined through her friendship with Lucas. Elena remarried, finding love with a widowed farmer who understood that accepting Rose's memory as part of their relationship was not a burden, but a gift. Their wedding was celebrated at the small church where Lucas had attended Rose's funeral years earlier, the same sanctuary where he'd learned that community was built through shared sorrows as well as shared joys. Lucas himself continued to divide his time between foundation work and the simple pleasures of life in Willowbrook. His health remained stable. His wealth continued to grow through careful management, but his sense of purpose remained rooted in the relationships and projects that connected him to something larger than personal achievement. He never remarried, never returned to the high-stakes business world that had once defined him, never regretted the choices that had led him away from conventional success toward something more personally meaningful. On a warm evening in June, as he approached his 70th birthday, Lucas sat on his front porch reading through applications for the Foundation's latest round of scholarships. The program had grown beyond anything he'd originally envisioned, now supporting educational opportunities for hundreds of young people throughout the region, while funding community development projects that strengthened the economic and social fabric of small towns, often overlooked by larger philanthropic organizations. A car pulled into his driveway, and Lucas looked up to see Mia emerging from the driver's seat, her now 5-year-old son racing ahead of her toward the porch where Lucas sat. Timothy was a serious, thoughtful child who reminded Lucas of his mother at that age, full of questions about the world and confident that adults would provide honest answers to even the most complicated inquiries. "Uncle Lucas," Timothy called, using the honorary title that had developed naturally over the years. "Mama says you have new books for me." Lucas smiled, setting aside his work to focus completely on his young friend. The routine of reading together had become one of his greatest pleasures, sharing stories with a child whose curiosity and enthusiasm reminded him of the wonder he'd rediscovered through his relationship with Mia. It was a different kind of legacy than the one he'd once imagined building, but infinitely more satisfying. As Mia settled into the chair beside him and Timothy climbed onto his lap with the selected book, Lucas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. If someone had told him a decade earlier that his greatest happiness would come from reading children's books on a small-town porch, while a foundation he'd never planned slowly changed lives throughout rural America, he would have considered them delusional. But life, he'd learned, had its own wisdom about what constituted authentic success. The fortune he'd accumulated through decades of careful investment and business development had become a tool for creating opportunities he could never have imagined during his years of focused wealth accumulation. The isolation he'd experienced after his accident had been transformed into relationships that provided more emotional sustenance than any luxury money could purchase. Most importantly, the sense of meaninglessness that had nearly destroyed him had been replaced by a deep understanding of how individual lives could be woven together into patterns of mutual support and shared purpose. The foundation would continue its work long after he was gone, guided by principles that Mia and others who'd learned the same lessons would carry forward into their own leadership roles. As the sun set over the prairie and Timothy's head grew heavy against his chest, Lucas understood that this was what redemption looked like, not a dramatic moment of transformation, but the gradual accumulation of days spent in service to something larger than oneself, surrounded by people whose love wasn't contingent on achievement or status, but on the simple willingness to remain present for both struggle and celebration. The wooden cross he'd once worn now rested against Mia's heart, but its meaning lived on in the countless lives that had been touched by the faith and determination it represented. Rosa's wisdom continued to guide decisions made in boardrooms and classrooms throughout the region, while the lessons Lucas had learned about the difference between success and significance influenced how foundation resources were deployed to maximum benefit. When Timothy finally fell asleep on his lap, Mia helped Lucas carry the child inside to the guest bedroom that had been prepared for their visit. As they stood looking down at the sleeping boy, Lucas felt the profound satisfaction that came from knowing his life had been fully lived, that his wealth had been transformed into something meaningful, that his temporary presence in the world had contributed to patterns of love and support that would continue long after his personal story ended. "Thank you," Mia said quietly as they returned to the porch, her words carrying the weight of all they'd experienced together. "For what?" Lucas asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "For listening to a little girl's letters, for believing that healing was possible even when the doctor said it wasn't, for showing me that wealth and wisdom could coexist, that success didn't require sacrificing kindness, that the most important things we build are the relationships that survive everything else." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a small town settling into evening, Lucas understood that this conversation was itself a gift, the opportunity to witness the full circle of love and influence, to see how seeds planted in faith and uncertainty had grown into something beautiful and lasting. The fireflies began their ancient dance across the yard, each brief illumination a reminder that beauty often came in small measures, that light could emerge from the darkest moments if one had patience to wait and eyes willing to see. In the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, marking the passage of time while somehow connecting this moment to all the moments that had come before, and all those yet to come. Lucas thought of Rosa, whose wisdom had guided him through his darkest hours, even after her death. He thought of Elena, whose quiet strength had shown him what true dignity looked like in the face of hardship. He thought of Timothy, who represented the future that justified all their present efforts, the continuation of hope through generations linked by love rather than blood. But most of all, he thought of Mia, the 10-year-old girl whose faith had been strong enough to reach across the barriers of wealth and status to touch a wounded heart. The teenager who'd walked beside him through cancer treatment and recovery, the young woman whose own work now carried forward the values they discovered together, the mother who was raising her son to believe in the same possibilities she'd once offered to a broken stranger. Winter came early that year, blanketing Willowbrook in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Lucas found himself walking the streets of his adopted hometown more often, his legs strong and sure beneath him, his heart full of gratitude for the simple ability to move through the world under his own power. The accident that had once seemed like an ending had instead become a doorway to a different kind of life, one defined not by what he could accumulate, but by what he could give away. The Harper Foundation announced its largest scholarship program yet that December, providing full college funding for 50 rural students whose academic achievements and community service had marked them as future leaders. Standing before the assembled families at the award ceremony, Lucas looked out at faces that reminded him of Mia at 10 years old, bright, hopeful, certain that the world held possibilities worth pursuing despite current limitations. "These young people don't need our money as much as they need our belief in them," he said in his speech that evening. They're already carrying the most important things: curiosity, determination, the values their communities have instilled in them. What we're providing is simply the opportunity for those qualities to flourish, the chance for their dreams to become reality. As he spoke, Lucas caught sight of Mia in the audience, Timothy sleeping in her lap, her face glowing with pride not for what he'd accomplished, but for who he'd become. The full circle of their relationship was visible in that moment. The man who'd been healed by a child's faith now working to heal others. The girl whose letters had saved a life now watching her influence ripple outward through generations she would never meet. The ceremony ended with the traditional singing of Amazing Grace, the hymn that Rosa had loved and that had become the Foundation's unofficial anthem. As voices from throughout the community joined together in the familiar melody, Lucas felt a presence that transcended the physical boundaries of the room. All the people who'd contributed to this moment, all the lives that would be changed by tonight's commitments, all the connections that linked past, present, and future in an unbroken chain of hope. Spring brought news that Lucas had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Dr. Peterson called on a Tuesday morning in April to inform him that the cancer had returned, this time with an aggressiveness that made further treatment unlikely to succeed. The doctor's voice carried genuine sadness as he delivered the prognosis, perhaps 6 months, maybe less, depending on how quickly the disease progressed. Lucas received the news in his kitchen, looking out the window at the garden Elena had taught him to plant, where the first green shoots of the season were pushing up through the soil in defiance of the winter's lingering grip. He felt no anger this time, no desperate scrambling for alternative solutions. Instead, there was a deep calm. The peace that came from knowing he'd spent his final healthy years well, that the work he'd begun would continue long after his departure. When he told Mia and Elena about the diagnosis, they responded with the same grace that had characterized all their interactions over the years. There were tears, of course, and plans to explore every possible treatment option, but underneath the natural grief was an acceptance of life's rhythms, an understanding that death was not defeat, but simply the next stage of a journey that had been rich with meaning. "What can we do?" Mia asked, her hand finding his across the kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals and conversations. "Help me finish well," Lucas replied. "Help me make sure the foundation is structured to continue its work. Help me write letters to the scholarship recipients, telling them what I believe about their potential and their responsibility to use their educations wisely. Most importantly, help me spend whatever time is left focusing on what matters most: this community, these relationships, the love that connects us all." The final months of Lucas Harper's life were perhaps the most purposeful he'd ever lived. Rather than retreating into self-pity or desperate medical interventions, he threw himself into completing the Foundation's work with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. He visited every community that had received grants, meeting with local leaders to ensure the programs would continue effectively. He recorded video messages for future scholarship ceremonies, wanting his voice to continue encouraging young people long after his physical presence was gone. But it was in the quiet moments that his transformation was most evident. He spent hours sitting on his front porch, watching the rhythms of small-town life unfold before him, with the appreciation of someone who'd learned to find joy in simple observations. Children playing in the yard, neighbors greeting each other on morning walks, the way sunlight moved across the buildings on Main Street, these became his daily entertainment, more satisfying than any boardroom triumph had ever been. Mia visited almost daily during those final weeks, sometimes bringing Timothy for reading sessions that continued their tradition, sometimes coming alone for conversations that allowed them to reflect on their shared journey. These talks revealed the depth of their mutual influence, how Mia's childhood wisdom had reshaped Lucas's understanding of success, how his adult perspective had helped her develop confidence in her own potential to create positive change. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked one afternoon as they sat watching clouds form patterns across the endless prairie sky. Lucas considered the question carefully. Were there business opportunities he might have pursued differently? Relationships he could have treated with more care? Years he'd wasted chasing goals that ultimately brought no satisfaction? Certainly. But regret seemed like the wrong word for his reflections on the past. "I wish I'd learned these lessons earlier," he said finally. "I wish I'd understood sooner that wealth was a tool rather than a destination, that success without love was just elaborate loneliness, that the best investments were always made in people rather than portfolios. But I can't regret the journey that brought me to these realizations, especially when that journey led me to you and your family." As summer reached its peak, Lucas's strength began to fade noticeably. The foundation's board meetings moved to his house, conducted on the front porch where he could participate while remaining comfortable. He found deep satisfaction in watching Mia step naturally into leadership roles, her voice carrying increasing weight in discussions about program directions and community needs. She'd grown into exactly the kind of leader he'd hoped she would become, principled but flexible, visionary but practical, ambitious for positive change while remaining grounded in the values of her upbringing. The last major foundation event Lucas attended was the groundbreaking ceremony for the Rosa Rodriguez Community Health Center, a facility that would provide medical care to 3 counties' worth of rural residents who'd previously had to travel hours for basic treatment. As he sat in his wheelchair, mobility challenges having returned as his body weakened, watching Elena turn the first shovel of earth, Lucas felt a completion that had nothing to do with personal accomplishment and everything to do with the continuation of love through practical action. "Grandmother would have been proud," Mia whispered, leaning close enough for only him to hear. "She is proud," Lucas replied with the certainty of someone who'd learned to believe in connections that transcended physical existence. "She's watching all of this, probably laughing at how long it took us to figure out what she understood all along, that the most important work we do is building bridges between hearts." August brought a heat wave that seemed to press down on the Illinois prairie like a physical weight, but Lucas found the warmth comforting rather than oppressive. He spent his days in the air-conditioned comfort of his living room, surrounded by photo albums and letters from scholarship recipients, thank you notes from families whose medical bills had been covered by the foundation, updates from communities where infrastructure projects were improving daily life in measurable ways. But the correspondence that meant most to him came from children, drawings and crayon-colored thank you notes from elementary students whose schools had received technology grants, handwritten essays from high schoolers describing how their college dreams had become possible through foundation scholarships. These young voices reminded him of Mia's first letter, the simple faith that had reached across barriers of age and circumstance to offer hope when hope seemed impossible. On a particularly warm evening in mid-August, as Lucas sat on his porch with Elena and Mia watching Timothy chase fireflies across the yard, he felt moved to share thoughts he'd been organizing in his mind for weeks. "I want you both to know," he began, his voice weaker than it had been, but still clear in its conviction, "that these past few years have been the best of my life, not because they were easy, they often weren't, but because they were real. They were about connection and purpose and love rather than achievement and acquisition and control." Elena reached over to take his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You gave us something too, Lucas. You showed Mia that dreams could become reality through hard work and education. You showed me that wealthy people could be kind and humble. You showed all of us that it's never too late to change, to become the person you were meant to be." As the evening deepened and Timothy grew tired from his play, they moved inside for what would be their last family dinner together. The meal was simple: Elena's homemade tamales, fresh corn from their garden, and iced tea sweetened the way Rosa had taught them all to prefer it. But the conversation was rich with memory and gratitude, with stories that celebrated not just Lucas's transformation, but the community of love that had made it possible. "Tell me about the letters again," Timothy requested sleepily from his place at the table, having heard the story countless times but never tiring of its retelling. "Well," Mia began, settling into the familiar rhythm of the tale. There once was a very wealthy man who thought he had everything money could buy, but he was actually very sad and lonely. And there was a little girl who lived in a small town who believed that everyone deserved to be loved and remembered, even strangers she'd never met. As Mia continued the story, Lucas listened with the wonder of someone hearing it for the first time, marveling at how a simple act of faith had grown into something so much larger than either of them could have imagined. The foundation now supported dozens of communities, hundreds of students, thousands of families whose lives had been improved by programs rooted in the values a 10-year-old girl had learned from her grandmother. Lucas Harper passed away peacefully on a Sunday morning in September, surrounded by the people who'd become his chosen family. His last coherent words were spoken to Mia, who was holding his hand as the early morning light filtered through the bedroom windows of the house that had become his true home. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but his eyes bright with gratitude, "for teaching me how to walk again, not just with my legs but with my heart." The funeral was held at the same small church where Rosa's service had taken place years earlier. But the crowd that gathered extended far beyond Willowbrook's boundaries. Representatives came from every community the foundation had supported, scholarship recipients traveled from colleges across the country, and business leaders from Chicago made the journey to honor a man who'd chosen love over profit, service over accumulation. But it was Mia's eulogy that captured the essence of who Lucas Harper had become in his final years. Standing at the pulpit, where she'd heard her grandmother's life celebrated, she spoke about transformation and redemption, about the power of unexpected connections to heal wounds that seemed permanent, about the responsibility that came with receiving love and the joy that accompanied giving it freely. "Lucas Harper was proof that it's never too late to change," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed sanctuary. "He showed us that wealth without love is poverty, that success without service is failure, that the most important things we can build are not monuments to ourselves, but bridges to each other. His greatest fortune was not measured in dollars, but in lives touched, dreams enabled, and futures made possible through belief in human potential." The Harper Foundation continued to grow and evolve in the years following Lucas's death, guided by the principles he and Mia had developed together and staffed by people who understood that their work was about more than distributing funds. It became a model for community-centered philanthropy, proving that sustainable change came not from imposing solutions from the outside, but from supporting the dreams and initiatives that arose from within communities themselves. Mia, now in her 30s and serving as the foundation's executive director, never forgot the lessons she'd learned from watching a broken man discover his capacity for healing and growth. She passed those insights on to her own children, to the young professionals she mentored, to the scholarship recipients who came to her for guidance as they navigated their own journeys from rural communities to expanded opportunities. The wooden cross that had traveled from Rosa to Lucas to Mia eventually found its way to Timothy, who wore it as he graduated from college with a degree in rural medicine, planning to return to communities like Willowbrook to provide health care to people who might otherwise go without. The simple carved symbol had become a tangible link between generations, carrying forward the faith and determination of a grandmother who'd believed in love's power to transform the hardest hearts. On quiet evenings when her work was done and her family was settled for the night, Mia would sometimes sit on her own front porch and remember the 10-year-old girl who'd decided to write letters to a stranger. She wondered if that child could have imagined the ripple effects of her simple act of faith, the thousands of lives changed, the communities strengthened, the proof that one person's belief in another's potential could indeed move mountains. The story of Lucas Harper and Mia Rodriguez became legend in Willowbrook and the surrounding communities, told and retold as evidence that miracles still occurred in ordinary places between ordinary people who chose to believe in extraordinary possibilities. Children learned from it that their voices mattered regardless of their age, that kindness was never wasted, that letters and prayers and simple acts of faith could indeed change the world one heart at a time. And you, have you ever received an unexpected letter that changed your perspective on what mattered most? Have you discovered that your greatest healing came not from medicine or money, but from the surprising connections that reminded you of your own capacity for growth and generosity? Perhaps right now, someone in your life needs the same kind of patient love that Mia offered to Lucas, the same willingness to see potential where others see only problems. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you that transformation is possible at any age and in any circumstance, please share it with someone who might need that reminder today. Leave a comment about the people who've helped you discover your own capacity for kindness, and subscribe so these messages of hope can reach other hearts that are ready to remember what truly matters. Sometimes the most powerful miracles happen quietly, one relationship at a time, one act of faith at a time, one choice to believe in love over fear at a time.